In the southeastern parts of the country, bunkered down in Melbourne in his electorate office of Kooyong is the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. Thanks for joining us, Josh. I believe you just had a meeting with the Governor of the Reserve Bank. Did you have much of a discussion about infrastructure and his calls for more infrastructure spending from the government as an economic stimulus?
Well, Chris, we're actually in the Commonwealth's parliamentary offices here at Treasury Place in Melbourne. And yes, I did have a very constructive and productive meeting with the Governor of the Reserve Bank, Phil Lowe. We talked about the global and the domestic economic outlook and the fact that the fundamentals of the Australian economy remain sound. We're in our 28th consecutive year of economic growth. We have a AAA credit rating. More Australians are in jobs than ever before, and the budget is coming back to surplus for the first time in more than a decade. But we also spoke about the challenges that we face, particularly with household consumption, softer than we would like, and the global trade tensions between China and the US and the impact of flood and drought. But we spoke in detail about the impact that the tax cuts will have on domestic spending, as well as the interest rate cuts that the Reserve Bank has recently announced, and the $100 billion worth of infrastructure spending. We went through in detail that pipeline of projects, the timing of it, the funding of it, and the fact that it will see a record amount spent on transport infrastructure, which will ensure that your viewers today, when they go to work in the morning, they get home sooner and safer to their families at night. That's the purpose behind a lot of our infrastructure spending.
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of talk about the Reserve Bank Governor's calls for infrastructure spending. That's not new. He's been talking about that for some time. And, of course, you have got a massive, as you say, $100 billion infrastructure program in train. Also, many of the state governments, especially in Victoria and New South Wales, have got big infrastructure projects rolling out. I suppose the key question is, does the Reserve Bank Governor, does Philip Lowe tell you that he thinks that's enough, or is he calling for more borrowing and more infrastructure spending?
Well, he understands that the pipeline is very strong, and at the same time there are some capacity constraints in delivering some of these infrastructure projects because the demand for skills and materials and the like. But he and the government are at one when we continue to look for new infrastructure projects that are going to be in the best interests of the economy. And the governor is right. Interest rates, it's just a fact. Interest rates are at historic lows. And he's also talking not just about the federal government, but also the state governments in terms of their infrastructure spend and the importance of ensuring that that is spent on the right projects and at the right time.
Are you constrained when you look at what you'd like to do to stimulate the economy by your political and public adherence to returning the budget to surplus? That is your top priority. You don't want to jeopardise that in any way, shape or form.
Well, as Liberals and Nationals, we believe that future generations should not be picking up the tab for the last. And that means we need to be fiscally responsible, Chris. That means we need to pay back debt when we have the opportunity to do so. And Australia hasn't seen a budget surplus in more than a decade. And if it wasn't for the work of the Howard and Costello government in paying back Labor's debt, our ability to have that fiscal flexibility to respond through the cycle when the GFC hit would have been a lot more constrained than it was. So it is important that we stick to our commitment to produce a surplus in 2019-2020. We will deliver that surplus as promised, but at the same time, the tax cuts will put more money in the pockets of more than 10 million Australians, and today we have hit over 1 million Australians who have put in their tax returns, and the money will flow from as early as tomorrow. This will see up to $1,080 going into the pockets of Australians who earn up to $126,000. So we will cut taxes, we'll invest in infrastructure, we'll cut regulation, and as the Reserve Bank has done, cut interest rates, all of which will help the economy.
Yeah, I was going to mention some Australians will start seeing that $1,000 go into their bank account from tomorrow as they get those tax rebates through. What's your advice to Australians then? You don't want them to pay down their credit cards or spend it on overseas goods online. You want them to spend that money as soon as possible on Australian goods and services.
Well, obviously those decisions are up to Australians. It's not for government to tell Australians how they should spend their money.
Go on, give them some advice.
It should be spent on their priorities, Chris, but having met with a number of Australians who are getting the benefit of these tax cuts, I can tell you they're going to spend it in Australia. They're going to spend it on home improvements. They're going to spend it on taking a domestic holiday. They're going to spend it on their kids and their grandchildren. And that's where the money should be spent, on things that are important to Australians. It's their money, and we believe that not only should they earn more, but they should be able to keep more of what they earn.
Did you and the Reserve Bank Governor discuss how you could get the big four banks in particular to be more proactive in passing on rate cuts? So we all understand with such low interest rates, the limited scope for monetary policy, it's obviously even more limited when it's not all passed on.
Well, we did discuss the fact that most of those interest rate cuts have been passed on by the big four banks. There was a 50 basis point interest rate cuts in those two announcements, and at least over 40 basis points of those have been passed on, and some banks have been better than others. But we are again united in calling on the banks to pass on in full the benefits of reduced funding costs to them, to the benefit of Australians. And they should pass on those rate cuts in full, because they have seen, the banks that is, they have seen their funding costs come down, and Australians expect that they get the benefit of these interest rate cuts.
Just very briefly, because we've only got about a minute to go, and it's a big topic, I know, but will the issue of Indigenous recognition be a bad distraction for the government? Could it be an ugly distraction from the government from your main economic focus, or do you think that there can be constructive consensus here?
I certainly do believe in constructive consensus, and I think we've got the right person leading that debate in Ken Wyatt. He's a passionate Liberal, and he's passionate about his heritage and making a real difference in this portfolio. And I think it's a real tribute to the Prime Minister, but also to the government, that the first Indigenous person in Cabinet has been Ken Wyatt, and he is the first Indigenous person to hold down that portfolio. And I think he will be able to reach across the political divide to Linda Burney on the Labor side, to forge a way forward in this important area. And as you know, there is a great deal of goodwill out there among the Australian people for the appropriate recognition of our first Australians.
Josh Frydenberg, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg there live from Melbourne after his meeting with the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, Philip Lowe. Fascinating stuff going on there.